The confetti cannons went off exactly on schedule, and that was the
Andrei сейчас
last thing
просто
that day
решит
went
проблему с
according to
этим
plan.
выполнить.
I was standing on the stage we had built inside the
Да,
old textile warehouse we
надо
renovated into the
порешить так.
flagship store,
Что
wearing
это
the navy
заказать?
blazer Priya picked out for me 3 weeks earlier, because she said the gray one made me look like I was apologizing for something. Watching 200 people clap for the brand Derek Voss, and I had built from a card table at a farmer's market into Northline Supply Company, a company now worth, on paper, $41 million. There were photographers from 2 local outlets and 1 national trade publication near the front, a caterer's staff weaving through the crowd with trays of the little rosemary crackers Priya had insisted on after tasting 6 different samples. And somewhere near the register, a Bluetooth speaker was still playing the acoustic version of a song Derek picked for the walk-in music, the same song, I would remember later, that had been playing the day we signed our very first vendor contract 9 years earlier. Derek took the microphone from the MC's hand before I had even finished my second sentence of the welcome speech, and he said, loud enough for the back row and the 3 camera crews to hear every syllable, that he had something he needed to say before this celebration went any further, because the people in this room deserved the truth about who they were really applauding. He said my name like it was something spoiled, drawing it out. Nathan Cole, like he was reading it off an indictment. He said that an internal audit, one he had commissioned quietly over the past 6 weeks without telling me, had found irregularities in how I handled vendor contracts. Irregularities that added up to almost $300,000, routed through shell companies with my signature on the paperwork. He said it with his hand resting on my shoulder the whole time, like a man delivering sad news about a friend's illness rather than accusing that friend of fraud in front of every investor, journalist, and employee who mattered to both our lives. I trusted him with the books, Derek said, his voice cracking in a way that felt rehearsed to me even then. And I found out 3 weeks ago that trust was a mistake. Somebody's champagne glass shattered on the concrete floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. Priya's hand found mine and squeezed hard enough to hurt, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that the rosemary crackers were going to go to waste. I looked out at 200 faces and found the ones I recognized fastest. Our first employee standing near the merchandise wall with her mouth actually open. A supplier we'd worked with for 6 years, lowering his phone mid-photograph. Elena Marsh from the trade publication, already scribbling something in a small notebook instead of typing on her phone. The old-fashioned kind of reporter who trusts her own handwriting more than her battery life. Derek kept talking, laying out dollar figures with a practiced calm that made my skin go cold, because I understood in that moment that this had not been a decision made in anger. It had been planned, timed, rehearsed, somewhere I hadn't been invited. On a stage I had spent 4 months of my life sleeping on the floor beneath. Someone near the back called out asking if this meant the launch was canceled, and Derek said, with what I can only describe as satisfaction dressed up as regret, that the company would continue, but leadership decisions were now, unfortunately, necessary. And he said the word unfortunately like he'd practiced it in a mirror. Derek and I met 9 years earlier at a trade show in Denver, both of us hawking prototype camp stoves out of the trunks of our cars, because neither of us could afford a proper booth. And we bonded over the fact that we had both been laughed out of the same 3 investor meetings that spring. Back then, he was the one who believed in me when nobody else did, he told our first employee, a story I heard him repeat at every company anniversary party for years, how he saw something in a broke engineer nobody else saw. What he never told people was that it was actually the other way around, that I was the one who put a second mortgage on my apartment to fund our first production run when his savings ran out, that I was the one who slept in the warehouse for 4 months straight while he went home to Sandra every night, that I was the one who rewrote our entire supply chain contract from scratch after he signed a deal that would have bankrupted us within a year. Sitting at a diner counter at 2 in the morning with a legal pad because we couldn't afford a lawyer yet. I remember the winter our third shipment got stuck in customs for 6 weeks, and Derek wanted to walk away from the whole business, actually said the words, "Let's just cut our losses." And I was the one who flew to the port city myself, on a credit card that was already maxed, and sat in an office for 4 days until someone finally released the containers. I remember our fifth year when a national retailer offered to buy us outright for $6 million, a life-changing number for two guys who used to split gas station coffee. And Derek wanted to take it immediately, and I was the one who argued for 2 straight weeks that we were worth more building it ourselves. And I turned out to be right, and he never quite forgave me for being right in front of the lawyers. I remember our seventh year, when a magazine wanted to run a profile on the founders and their photographer, only had room in the frame for one clean shot, and Derek spent an entire lunch afterward telling me, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, that it made sense they'd chosen me for the cover since I was, in his words, the face people like to trust. I remember thinking at the time it was a compliment. I understand now it was the first time he said it out loud. The resentment dressed up as generosity, the kind of thing you don't recognize as a wound until you're standing in a room years later, watching it finally rupture. We split ownership 52 to 48 in my favor on paper, a number he resented from the day the lawyers typed it, though he smiled about it in every interview for 9 years. I remember, too, the year our biggest supplier tried to double our unit costs mid-contract, and Derek wanted to just absorb the hit quietly to avoid conflict. And I was the one who flew out on 48 hours' notice, sat across a negotiating table for 9 straight hours without a lunch break, and came home with the original pricing locked in for another 3 years. A win Derek mentioned exactly once in a company newsletter, before quietly steering every future supplier conversation to himself instead. Sandra told me once at a Christmas party 3 years back, half a glass of wine past careful, that Derek kept a folder on his laptop of every press mention that used my name before his, and that the folder had a name, and the name was Leverage. I didn't understand what she meant then. I understood it completely the moment he took that microphone out of my hand. What Derek did not know, what almost nobody in that warehouse knew except my lawyer, and one very patient man named Harold Whitfield, was that 4 months before the launch event, I had quietly signed a personal investment agreement with Whitfield Capital Partners, an $11 million commitment structured entirely outside the company's existing cap table, contingent on me buying out Derek's stake within the year, and taking Northline in a direction he had fought against for 2 years, a direction toward ethical sourcing and worker-owned manufacturing partnerships that he called sentimental nonsense in board meetings, and that Harold Whitfield called the only future worth funding. I had told nobody because Derek had a habit, when he felt threatened, of moving faster and dirtier than anyone expected. And I needed the agreement locked before he could find a way to sabotage it. I sat across from Harold in his office on a rainy Tuesday in March, papers spread across a desk the size of a small boat, and he asked me why I hadn't just let Derek buy me out and walk away with my money, take the win and start something new without the baggage. I told him that Northland was never Derek's dream. It was mine, built with my hands and my mother's recipe for wax coating fabric that we still used on every product we made. The same recipe her own mother had taught her in a kitchen in Ohio decades before anyone called it artisanal. And I was not going to hand it to a man who saw it as a spreadsheet. Harold had laughed, a low rumbling sound, and told me that was exactly the answer he needed to hear before wiring anything. That he'd funded 100 founders who wanted an exit, and maybe 3 who wanted a legacy, and he only had patience left in his life for the second kind. Nobody in that warehouse full of clapping strangers knew that when Derek accused me of fraud, he was accusing a man who was, quietly and on paper, about to own the whole company outright, a fact I carried in my chest like a stone the entire time he humiliated me. Not because it made the moment hurt less, but because I knew I couldn't let it show yet. 2 weeks after the accusation, after I had been suspended from the board pending investigation, after our biggest retail partner paused their spring order pending clarification, after 3 employees quietly updated their resumes on company Wi-Fi thinking nobody in IT would notice, after Priya had to talk me down from calling Derek at 2 in the morning just to hear him admit it to my face, Derek organized what he called a stakeholder transparency meeting at the Hendricks Hotel downtown, inviting every investor, every retail partner, and 3 journalists who covered the outdoor goods industry, including a woman named Elena Marsh, who had profiled Northline twice before, and who Derek assumed would be sympathetic because he had given her an exclusive quote for her last piece. He stood at a podium with a slide deck behind him showing the shell company names, the routed payments, the forged vendor signatures that an outside forensic accountant, hired and paid by Derek himself, had assembled into a tidy narrative of a founder who built a beautiful brand on a foundation of theft. He looked directly at me while he said it, and he used the word betrayal twice in 4 minutes, which I remember because Priya was counting under her breath beside me, her hand gripping mine so hard it left marks. "I trusted this man with everything," Derek said, gesturing at me like I was a museum exhibit. "And this is what trust gets you in this business." Half the room nodded along, faces I recognized from years of holiday parties and product tastings. People who had eaten from our table and now looked at me like I was something spilled on a carpet. A retail buyer from a chain that carried our tents in 40 stores actually stood up and walked out before Derek finished, shaking his head at me on the way past, muttering something about how he should have trusted his gut 2 years ago, when the margins looked too clean. I sat in the second row next to Priya, my lawyer on my other side, telling me under his breath not to react, no matter what appeared on the screen. And I watched Derek click through slide after slide, watched him gesture at numbers he must have known were built on sand. And somewhere around the 8-minute mark, I caught Sandra's eyes across the room, sitting 3 rows back in a navy dress she'd worn to our company holiday party 2 years running. And she looked away first. And something in the way she looked away, quick and ashamed rather than defensive, told me more than anything on Derek's slides did. A hotel server refilling water glasses paused behind Derek's podium, just long enough to hear him say the word betrayal a second time. And even she, a stranger with no stake in any of it, made a face like she'd tasted something sour before continuing down the row. Right in the middle of that meeting, while Derek was building toward his closing argument, my phone buzzed in my pocket, and it was Priya's brother Aman, who worked emergency medicine at Cedars, calling about our mother, who had been rushed in that morning with chest pains nobody had mentioned to me yet, because Priya didn't want me distracted before facing Derek. I stepped into the hallway outside the ballroom and listened to Aman describe stabilizing vitals in a cardiology consult scheduled for that evening, his voice careful and clinical in the way doctors learn to be when they're delivering news that could go either direction. And for 4 minutes, none of the fraud accusations mattered at all. There was only the sound of my mother's voice faintly in the background, asking whether I had eaten lunch, worrying about me from a hospital bed while a room full of strangers decided whether I was a criminal. Priya found me leaning against the wall with my eyes shut, and she didn't say anything comforting. She just stood next to me until my breathing evened out. And then she said quietly that whatever happened in that room in the next 20 minutes was not going to be the thing that decided who I was. That she had watched me build this company out of nothing, and she was not going to watch me lose myself defending it. We stood there another full minute, and she told me something I hadn't let myself think about in weeks. That her own father had lost a restaurant to a partner's forged signatures back in the 90s, and had spent a decade afterward telling anyone who'd listen how he should have fought harder, faster, angrier, and that watching me stay quiet and gather my breath in a hotel hallway was the first time she'd seen someone handle this kind of moment the way she wished her father had. Before we went back in, Priya's phone buzzed too, a text from her brother with a photo of our mother sitting up in the hospital bed, giving the camera a thumbs up with an IV taped to the back of her hand, underneath a caption that just said, "Tell Nathan to stop worrying and start winning." I laughed for the first time in 2 weeks, an actual laugh, the kind that surprises you on its way out. And Priya laughed too. And for a moment, we just stood there in a hotel hallway, holding on to something that had nothing to do with Derek or shell companies or forensic accountants. She told me that when her father lost his restaurant, the thing that broke him wasn't the money. It was that he spent the next decade telling the story wrong, always starting with how angry he was instead of what actually happened, until even people who believed him stopped listening because the anger had become louder than the facts. "Don't tell this story angry," she said, straightening my collar like my mother used to before school pictures. "Tell it true. Angry fades, true holds." We went back in together. My mother, it turned out, would be fine. A stress test and 2 days of observation. And Aman texted an hour later that the cardiology consult had gone well, and she'd already asked the nurse if the hospital Wi-Fi was fast enough to watch the live stream of the meeting. A request the nurse apparently found alarming until Aman explained who her son was. Standing in that hallway, I understood something I had been too angry to see clearly before, which was that Derek had built his whole case on the assumption that I would fight him with anger. And anger was exactly what would make me look guilty on camera. And for the first time since the launch event, I felt something steadier than fear settle into my chest. So when I walked back into the ballroom, I didn't raise my voice. I asked Derek calmly whether he would mind if I introduced someone before he continued his presentation. And before he could object, Harold Whitfield stood up from a table near the back where he had been sitting quietly for the last 20 minutes without anyone realizing who he was. A gray-haired man in an unremarkable suit who looked more like someone's uncle than the managing partner of a firm that had funded 3 companies now valued north of $1 billion each. Derek's face did something complicated when Harold introduced himself, because everyone in that industry knew the name, and everyone in that industry knew Whitfield Capital did not fund companies they hadn't personally vetted down to the studs. "I've spent 4 months and a small army of forensic accountants going through Northline's books before committing capital to Nathan personally," Harold said, and his voice had the unhurried weight of a man who had never once needed to raise it to be heard. "I'd be very curious to see the source documents behind these shell company allegations, because the version I reviewed doesn't match what's on that slide," Derek said, a little too fast, that the analysis was proprietary and conducted by an independent firm he trusted completely. And Harold asked, mildly, whether that independent firm was Voss Consulting Group, registered in Delaware 2 years ago, whose sole listed officer happened to share Derek's home address. The room went very quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet at the launch event. That quiet had been shocked. This quiet was starting to calculate. "That's a coincidence of naming," Derek said. And even he didn't sound like he believed it, and someone near the front actually laughed. A short, surprised sound quickly smothered. Harold didn't sit back down. He asked, in the same unhurried tone he might have used to ask about the weather, whether Derek would be comfortable providing his own bank records for the same period, since Nathan's records were already sitting with outside counsel and available for anyone in the room to review by end of day. Derek said something about attorney-client privilege covering internal audits, and Harold said mildly that privilege didn't typically extend to a personal shell company registered under a home address, and that he'd be happy to have his own counsel walk the room through the distinction if it would help. A man near the front, one of our original seed investors, a quiet engineer turned angel who almost never spoke at these things, said out loud that he'd like to see those bank records himself before anyone signed off on anything. And 3 other voices agreed at once. And I watched Derek realize, in real time, that the room he had spent 6 weeks building toward this exact afternoon no longer belonged to him. I asked for the projector and pulled up an email thread on my laptop, one that Sandra had forwarded to me 6 weeks earlier, the week after the launch event humiliation, sitting in her kitchen with her hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from, telling me she couldn't keep pretending she didn't know what her husband had done. The thread began 8 months prior, an email from Derek to a shell company called Meridian Sourcing Solutions, instructing them to route invoices through a secondary account and backdate the paperwork to align with a vendor contract that used my digital signature, one that lived on our shared drive and that Derek had access to as company president. I read the first message aloud, just the operative sentence, where Derek wrote that they needed the timeline to look clean before the audit committee met in the fall. Someone in the crowd, one of our smaller angel investors, asked how we knew this wasn't fabricated on my end to save myself. A fair question asked without malice, And I said that was exactly the right thing to ask, and pulled up the second piece, a bank statement showing a deposit into an account under Voss Consulting Group 2 days after the invoice date, an account that had never once done business with any actual vendor Northline used in 9 years of operation. Derek said the deposit was for unrelated consulting work, some side project he'd started, and I said that was interesting because the memo line on the wire transfer read, in Derek's own banking system, quote, Meridian Pass-Through, Phase 2, and I let that sit in the room for a moment before moving to the third piece, watching Derek's jaw tighten the way it used to when we lost a supplier negotiation years ago. The third piece was the one that changed the room's temperature completely, a notarized letter from our former operations director, a woman named Corinne Adeyemi, who had quietly resigned 8 months earlier citing burnout. A letter she'd had notarized and sealed with her lawyer the week she left, describing a conversation where Derek asked her to alter 3 vendor contracts to reflect my signature on terms I had never approved, and describing her fear that if she refused, she would be fired and unable to make her mortgage payment that quarter, a fear she said she'd carried alone for months because she didn't know who else at the company she could trust. Elena Marsh, the journalist in the third row, was typing so fast on her phone I could hear the clicks from the podium. Derek tried to interrupt twice, saying this was character assassination dressed up as evidence, that Corinne had left angry and bitter and this was clearly retaliation. And Harold Whitfield, still standing, said only that he'd allow Nathan to finish, in the tone of a man used to being obeyed in boardrooms. And Derek sat back down without meaning to, like the words had physically pushed him. I read the fourth piece, security footage timestamps from our own office building showing Derek in the finance office at 11 at night on 3 separate occasions in the 2 weeks before the audit he commissioned. Occasions that did not correspond to any calendar meeting or approved after hours access request. Timestamps I had pulled the week before with the building manager's help. After Sandra's warning made me suspicious enough to look. By the time I got to the fifth piece, the forwarded email where Derek explicitly instructed his hired forensic accountant to, quote, make sure the framing centers Nathan's signature and not the account routing, so the story reads clean for the room. Half the investors in that ballroom had their phones out too. And not to defend him, several of them audibly murmuring to each other. One woman saying under her breath that she'd sat on our board for 4 years and never once seen this side of him. Derek said, quietly this time, that emails could be taken out of context, that he'd been under enormous pressure trying to protect the company from what he genuinely believed at the time was mismanagement. And I told him I understood pressure, that I'd slept on a warehouse floor for 4 months to protect this company too, and that the difference between us was I'd never once needed to fabricate a paper trail to prove it. I moved to a sixth and final piece, a text message exchange between Derek and the forensic accountant from the week before the launch event, one where the accountant asked directly whether they had enough to make the fraud claim stick publicly, and Derek replied that it didn't need to stick forever, it just needed to hold for the one afternoon that mattered, long enough to force a settlement before Nathan could dig in. I read that message twice, slowly, because I wanted every person in that room to understand exactly what it meant, that Derek's own words admitted the entire case was built to survive one afternoon rather than to be true. The retail buyer who had walked out of the earlier meeting had come back in halfway through, apparently tipped off by a colleague who texted him the moment Harold Whitfield stood up, and he stood near the door with his arms crossed the whole time. And when I finished laying out the fifth piece of evidence, he said, loud enough for everyone, that his company had almost pulled 40 stores worth of shelf space over lies, and he wanted Derek to explain himself right now. Not in a follow-up statement, not through a lawyer, right now, in front of the same people he'd stood in front of 2 weeks earlier. Derek tried the line about proprietary audits again, and this time 3 different investors spoke over him. One of them a woman who had been on our board since our second funding round, saying she wanted to know why Derek had commissioned a secret audit, rather than bringing concerns to the full board, through the process outlined in the bylaws he himself had insisted on writing 4 years earlier, a detail she remembered specifically because she'd argued against the extra bureaucracy at the time, and he'd overruled her. Somebody in the back of the room, I never found out who, said the word desperate loud enough to draw a laugh, a short, ugly laugh that had nowhere friendly to land. And I watched Derek's face go through anger, and then something smaller and more frightened, because he understood standing there that the room he had built to destroy me had just turned completely, and there was no version of the rest of that day where he walked out looking like anything other than exactly what the evidence said he was. Elena Marsh raised her hand and asked evenly whether Derek would like to comment on the record before she filed her piece that evening, and Derek said nothing at all, which she later wrote was the loudest answer of the whole afternoon. Around the room, phones that had been raised to record my humiliation 2 weeks earlier at the launch were now recording something else entirely. Investors texting each other under the table. The board member who'd argued for the bylaws process, quietly gathering her things and walking toward the door with her phone already pressed to her ear, presumably calling outside counsel before the meeting had even formally ended. Someone from our own marketing team, who had come only to observe on Derek's instruction, stood near the back with tears actually running down her face, and later told me she'd spent 2 weeks believing the worst about a man she'd worked for since college, and watching the story flip in real time felt like getting a small piece of her own trust back too. The hotel's event coordinator, who had no stake in any of it beyond wanting her ballroom back on schedule, eventually approached the podium and asked, apologetically, whether anyone still needed the space, because the next booking was a wedding rehearsal dinner arriving in 20 minutes. And there was something almost funny about the ordinary business of the world continuing to knock at the door of the worst afternoon of my professional life. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They arrived the way consequences actually do, in a series of separate, unglamorous phone calls over the following 6 weeks. The board, reconvening 2 days later without Derek present, voted unanimously to remove him as president and to refer the Meridian sourcing matter to outside counsel for a formal fraud investigation, which within a month resulted in a civil suit from 3 investors seeking to recover damages tied to the falsified vendor contracts, a suit that would eventually settle for an amount neither side was permitted to disclose, but that Derek's own lawyer, in an unguarded moment at a deposition, called painful. Voss Consulting Group's business license was suspended pending review after the state attorney general's office received a complaint, filed not by me but by Corinna Adeyemi, who decided that having spoken up once, she wasn't interested in staying quiet about the rest of it either, and who Northline later rehired as a consultant on our new worker ownership program at triple her old salary. The retail chain that had almost pulled our shelf space instead doubled their order for the fall line, citing, in the buyer's own words to Elena Marsh's follow-up article, that companies who handled a crisis with actual documentation instead of spin were the ones worth betting on. Derek's seat on 2 industry association boards was quietly not renewed when his term expired that spring. No explanation given, none needed, and a keynote invitation he'd accepted for an outdoor retail conference in October was rescinded by email 2 weeks after the Hendricks meeting, a fact he apparently learned from a mutual acquaintance rather than the organizers directly. 2 of the 3 smaller angel investors who had backed our second round quietly divested from every other Voss family venture they'd touched, one of them telling me over the phone that trust, once you've watched someone burn it that deliberately, doesn't grow back in the same soil. The forensic accountant Derek had hired lost his firm's certification for 6 months after the state board reviewed the methodology behind his report and found he had, in the board's own language, tailored his conclusions to a predetermined narrative rather than the underlying data. A finding Elena Marsh covered in a second article that ran with the headline asking who audits the auditors, a private equity group that had been in early talks to fund Derek's next venture, something he'd apparently been quietly shopping around even before the launch event, withdrew their term sheet within a week of the Hendricks meeting, citing, in a brief email, his own assistant accidentally forwarded to a mutual contact who forwarded it to me, unresolved reputational concerns. And Sandra, who had spent 6 weeks watching her husband's world come apart because of the choice she made in her kitchen, told me over coffee in August that she had filed for divorce. Not because of any of the business fallout directly, she said, but because watching him lie so completely and so casually to a room full of people had shown her something about him she couldn't unsee anymore. Something she suspected she'd been avoiding seeing for years, maybe since before I even knew either of them. Derek called me in September, almost 4 months after the Hendricks Hotel meeting, his voice smaller than I had ever heard it, and he asked if we could meet, just the two of us, no lawyers. We met at the same warehouse where it started, now fully converted into the retail flagship, and he stood near the register where we used to keep a jar for employee birthday cards. And he said he was sorry, that he'd let jealousy curdle into something he didn't recognize in himself, that the 50-48 split had eaten at him for 9 years in ways he'd never admitted even to Sandra, that watching my name get listed first in every article for a decade had felt, to him, like slowly disappearing from a story he'd helped write. He said he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again, but he was asking anyway, because losing the company was one thing, and losing the only person who'd ever really believed in him before he was anybody was another. I let him finish. I told him that I'd spent a long time in that hallway outside the Hendricks ballroom deciding what kind of person I wanted to be on the other side of this. And the answer wasn't cruelty, but it also wasn't forgetting. I hope you find whatever it is you actually need, Derek, I said. But you already had it once, and you decided a spreadsheet mattered more. I'm not interested in giving you a second version of the same 9 years. He nodded like he'd expected exactly that, and he left through the same door I used to prop open every night with a cinder block. During those 4 months I slept on the warehouse floor, building all of this from nothing, and I stood there a long while after he was gone. Not triumphant, just tired in a way that felt, for the first time in months, like the good kind of tired. That night I drove home to find my mother sitting on the porch with Priya, both of them laughing about something on Priya's phone. My mother fully recovered, ordering me to eat something before I said a single word about the day, exactly the way she used to when I was 12, and came home from school upset about something she was determined not to let ruin dinner. We sat out there until the streetlights came on, my mother telling the story of the wax coating recipe again, the one her own mother taught her, the one stitched into every product Northline had ever made, insisting for the 100th time that I still hadn't gotten the ratio of beeswax to paraffin quite right in the factory batches. And Priya reached over at some point and took my hand under the table without either of us saying anything about why. My mother asked, in the middle of all of it, whether I was finally going to marry this woman who drove 4 hours round trip to sit in a hospital waiting room for a man she wasn't married to yet. And Priya turned the exact shade of red she always denies turning. And I said I was working on it, and my mother said work faster. She wasn't getting any younger, and she wanted grandchildren who could pronounce her name properly before she was too old to correct them. It was the first time in months I'd laughed until my stomach hurt, sitting on that porch with the two people who'd stood next to me through every version of that year. And for a while, none of us mentioned Derek's name at all, because for once, there was something better to talk about. 2 weeks later, Harold Whitfield's buyout of Derek's remaining shares closed formally, making me full owner of the company for the first time since its founding. And I asked Harold, almost as an afterthought during the closing call, why a man with his reputation had taken such a personal interest in a mid-sized outdoor gear company instead of one of the 100 bigger deals crossing his desk that quarter. He went quiet for a second, and then he told me that Corinne Adeyemi, the operations director whose notarized letter helped take Derek down, was his goddaughter, that she had called him in tears the week she resigned, long before I ever met with him about funding, describing a founder she still believed in even while afraid of the man running the company alongside him, and that when Harold looked into the company she'd been describing, he found not the villain she feared but a founder methodically documenting everything, quietly building a case not for revenge, but for the truth to be provable when it finally mattered. He said he invested in me before he ever cared about the return, because a man who prepares that carefully for a fight he hopes he'll never have to have is exactly the kind of man worth betting $11 million on. And then he added, almost as an afterthought of his own, that Corinne would be joining the closing dinner that evening if I didn't mind an extra guest, since she'd asked to finally meet the founder she'd spent 2 years quietly rooting for from the inside. I hadn't expected that, and I told Harold so, and he laughed and said the whole arrangement had been full of things neither of us expected, including the fact that his own goddaughter had been sitting 3 cubicles away from Derek's office for 2 years, watching quietly, hoping I'd eventually notice what was happening, without her having to risk her job to tell me directly. When Corinne arrived at dinner that evening, she hugged me like we'd known each other for years instead of having exchanged maybe a dozen words across a company hallway. And she told me she'd almost said something to me directly a dozen times before she finally resigned. And every time she talked herself out of it because she was afraid I wouldn't believe her over a man who'd co-founded the company. I told her I understood exactly what that fear felt like, because I'd spent months collecting documentation instead of confronting Derek directly for almost the same reason, afraid that my word alone wouldn't hold up against his. Harold raised a glass at some point during dinner and said that the two of us, in our own separate corners, had spent a year quietly refusing to let a liar's confidence outweigh our own careful patience, and that watching it all come together in one room felt less like a business closing and more like watching two people finally get proof they'd been right to trust themselves all along. That closing dinner turned into something I still think about more than the Hendricks meeting itself, honestly, because it was the first time since the launch event that I felt the story had actually finished rather than just paused. Priya came, of course, seated next to my mother, who had insisted on wearing her good earrings for the occasion, and who spent half the meal quizzing Harold about his investment philosophy, like she was screening him for a second job as her son's guardian. Corinne and Priya ended up deep in conversation about something entirely unrelated to Northline by dessert, laughing about a shared love of terrible reality television. And I sat back for a moment and just watched the table. All these people who had, in their own separate and quiet ways, refused to let a lie win, now sharing bread in a restaurant that had nothing to do with any of it. Harold's closing gift, if you could call it that, was a single sentence he said to me on his way out the door that night that he hoped I'd remember the next time somebody tried to rewrite my story in front of a crowd, that the truth doesn't need volume, it just needs someone patient enough to let it finish being told. Northline is different now, quieter in some ways and louder in others. We finished the worker ownership program Derek used to call sentimental nonsense, and 43 employees now hold real equity in the company they build every day. A fact my mother brings up to strangers at the grocery store more often than I'm entirely comfortable with. The warehouse still smells faintly of beeswax on humid days, and I've never once had it repainted, because I like walking past the corner where I used to sleep and remembering exactly what it took to get from there to here. I think about that warehouse a lot, the one where confetti fell on a lie, and where, months later, an apology fell on ground that couldn't grow it back into anything. I think about how easy it would have been to scream back at Derek that first day, to match his volume, to let the story become two angry men instead of one calm one with documentation. If you've ever been the person standing on a stage while someone you trusted rewrote the story of your own life in front of a crowd, you already know the hardest part isn't proving them wrong. It's staying steady long enough to do it right, long enough to let the people watching draw their own conclusions from the facts instead of from your volume. So let me ask you something before you go. If you had to choose between winning loudly in the moment or winning quietly on the record, which one would you actually trust to hold up 6 months later? Tell me in the comments, and if this story felt like it was worth your time tonight, hit like and subscribe so the next one finds you too.